We encourage you all to share and watch it as well when we disseminate it on YouTube. If you signed up for the webinar, you will receive an email with the link to the webinar on YouTube, but we will also share it with everyone who registered with the webinar, and all of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel. Good afternoon. Alianza Americas welcomes you to this webinar, Seeking Asylum in Mexico. The reason why we decided to convey this seminar is because we believe that it is of primary importance to discuss the asylum system in Mexico. And we also believe that it's important to have this discussion in English. What we expect to do here today is to discuss the asylum process, to identify the most pressing challenges and the impact of current regional policies on those persons who are fleeing their countries and are seeking international protection. We will also discuss the obstacles that these individuals face and how they attempt to overcome them with the assistance of civil society organizations. Please remember that state parties to the Refugee Convention have developed domestic institutions and procedures to ensure the right to seek asylum and to grant individuals the status of refugee. Hence, it is important from our international understanding of refugee determination procedures or our familiarity with the asylum process, for instance, in the United States, to try to comprehend how the asylum system works in Mexico. We also have to keep in mind that as a result of the current US policies, individuals seeking asylum in the US most likely will need to seek asylum in Mexico or in other transit countries. Seeking asylum in Mexico is becoming more and more a first step in the process to be eligible to seek asylum in the US. And I am specifically referring to the new asylum rules that include this specific requirement for those individuals who are coming through the US southern border. Also, we have to keep in mind the militarized immigration deterrent policies that have been put in place in Mexico, particularly with the designation of 25,000 members of the recently created Guardia Nacional that collaborate with the Institute for Migration on the apprehension, detention, and expulsion of irregular foreigners who are transiting to the United States. Many foreigners also seek asylum in Mexico to avoid being forcibly returned to a country from which they are fleeing, to obtain a temporary status under which they are authorized to travel through Mexico so that they can arrive to the US border and attempt to seek asylum in the US. I also would like to make a few important conceptual clarifications before we begin. The first is on the use of the term asylum and refugee in Mexico and in the United States. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the American Convention on Human Rights specifically include the right to seek asylum. It is a human right, and it is guaranteed through the procedure under which it is determined whether a person is or is not a refugee. However, terms vary at the national level, and in the US, we refer to this process as the process to seek asylum, and individuals granted asylum are named asylees. In the US, refugees are those individuals who were granted asylum in another country, who are acknowledged as asylees and then are resettled into the US. In Mexico, the term refugee is referred to those individuals who sought asylum and that under Mexican legislation are determined to be refugees. Rarely do we use the term asylum used in Mexico. So it's important that we become familiar and we understand that our speakers today may be referring to asylum, referring to the process to be the status determination process that a person is a refugee under Mexican law, or they may use the term refugee when they are referring to an asylee. Please remember that there is a box for questions, and if you need further clarification on those terms, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And at the end of our question and answer of their presentations, we will open for a period of roughly half an hour for questions and answers, and we can make some of those clarifications later there. What we hope here is not only to discuss the procedure according to the law, but also look at the procedure in reality. How is it actually functioning? We also hope to be able to tap on some aspects related to the challenges that asylum seekers and asylees face when they are trying to integrate to Mexico, and to refer also to their safety conditions. We hope that this discussion today helps us to identify the aspects that could be strengthened, improved, or perhaps eliminated to further ensure and protect the right to seek asylum in Mexico. For this ambitious and complex discussion, we have a great panel today. We have two speakers with great experience and knowledge of the Mexican system. Here with us is Gretchen Kuhner, the director of the Instituto para las Mujeres en la Migración, IMUMI, in Mexico. Thank you, Gretchen, for being with us today. Gretchen is also a US lawyer, so she has this ability to be able to understand and the experience of working in the Mexican system, which is not found that often. And here also with us is Miriam González López, a protection officer from the Comisión Mexicana de Ayuda a Refugiados, la Comar, as it is known by its acronym in Mexico. Gretchen and Miriam, thank you very much for being here today with us. We really appreciate your presence and your time, and we hope that this is a very engaging discussion. I would like to start by asking each of you about the work of both IMUMI and la Comisión Mexicana de Ayuda a los Refugiados. Can you please explain who is IMUMI, what is la Comisión Mexicana de Ayuda a los Refugiados, what is the work that they do? Let's start with you, Gretchen.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. IMUMI is an organization, an NGO in Mexico City, based in Mexico City, and we provide direct legal representation to women migrants and their families. So it's not only asylum, but also in the legal clinic, we have a couple of US immigration attorneys who can work on U visas or VAWA visas. And then we also have a Mexican immigration attorney and a Mexican family law attorney. So we really focus on bringing together both, the options within this really restrictive framework in both Mexico and the United States, and try to provide people with, what their options are depending on what their needs are. So whether it's asylum or a humanitarian visa or family reunification, or sometimes, post-deportation relief as well for women who have been deported from the United States back to Mexico. So we sort of have our feet in both legal systems.
Thank you, Gretchen. Miriam, would you like to tell us about La Comar?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to say that Comar is the Mexican Commission for Refugee Aid, was established in 1980, and is a decentralized body of the Secretary of Government of Mexico. And Comar is a Mexican institution responsible for leading the refugee and complementary protection policy in Mexico. Comar is the only institution empowered to give an answer to all requests for recognition of refugee status in Mexico. And in this order of ideas, Comar analyzes every application and determines whether a person recognized or not as a refugee. At this moment, I want to say that Comar has three main offices: Mexico City, Tapachula, Chiapas, and Acayucan, Veracruz, one representation at Tenosique, Tabasco, and presence in Monterrey, Nuevo León, Tijuana, Baja California, and Palenque, Chiapas.
Thank you, Miriam. Okay, let's tackle a difficult and a big question, Gretchen. Can you try to take us through a process of a person that wants to seek asylum in Mexico? Where can they seek asylum? Gretchen, you're muted.
Thank you. If you're in Mexico, you can seek asylum at any one of the 4 COMAR offices or any one of the representation offices that Miriam just talked about. You can also request asylum at any of the National Immigration Institute offices throughout Mexico, and there's at least one in each of the 32 Mexican states. If you're in detention, immigration detention, and right now there's 60 immigration detention centers in Mexico, within the country, you can also request asylum from within detention. And then you can also request asylum at the border. If you go through an official port of entry between Guatemala and Mexico, or Belize in Mexico, then you can also request asylum at the border. I don't know if you want me to go into, diplomatic asylum, but you can also request political asylum in the different consulates, Mexican consulates throughout the world. But the asylum system that we're talking about today really refers to people who are requesting asylum within Mexico. And then also within the law, supposedly, anybody who needs asylum can go to any government agency on a federal level, a state level, or a municipal level and tell that government agent, I need protection, I need to seek asylum, and that person is supposed to know how to refer the asylum seeker to one of the offices. So there is something stipulated within the law that involves all government, people working in government in general.
Okay, and from your experience, what is the difference between filing an asylum petition at a COMAR office versus doing so before the INM?
Yeah, so lots of times the INM offices are resistant to accepting applications, and specifically if you're in detention, right? Because the INM is also in charge of all of the detention centers. So a lot of times what we find is that people will say, I'm afraid to go back to my country, but then they're not told, about the right to seek asylum from immigration officials within the detention centers, or they're told, oh, you don't want to you don't want to do that because you're going to be in detention for 6 months, that kind of thing. And so I'm sure that it depends on, where you're detained throughout the country, what immigration agent, you're talking to, but that's what we hear a lot from people who are in detention.
Thank you. Miriam, can you please try to walk us through the asylum procedure? How does a person seek asylum? What are kind of the main stages of the process or phases? Which authorities are involved in each of the phases, and whether there are any legal limits or time limits for each of the phases of the asylum procedure. If it's helpful, I have the diagram from UNHCR in English. Would you like me to project it? Would it help you with your presentation, or you would prefer to speak without it?
No, you can put it. I'm going to explain.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to say that all foreigners in a Mexican territory, just wait a second. Okay, all foreigners in Mexican territory have 30 business days to request recognition of refugee status in our country. I mean, from Monday to Friday, okay? If a foreigner has more than 30 days in Mexico, that person has to explain why she couldn't submit the application on time, and COMAR evaluates the reason and decides whether to accept the application or not. Foreigners need to present identity and travel documents And if they don't have them, they need to explain why they don't have them. I think that it's important to mention that if a person does not have any document, it's not an obstacle to submit their refugee application. After the request is submitted, Comar provides a document that proves that a foreigner person has a procedure with us and identifies them as a refugee applicant. It is significant to mention that Comar notifies to the Migration Institute when a person is a refugee applicant, so they cannot be returned to their country because of the principle of no defaultment. There are two important interviews in the process. The first one is with the assistant department, and here we can detect if someone has a vulnerability situation or needs to be channeled to a specific institution, for example, to a hospital or to a shelter. And the second interview is with the protection department. At this moment, applicants explains the reason why they left their country, why they can go back, and why their life is in danger. With all the information applicants provide to Comar and information of their files, Comar analyzes the case and can give three possible answers. The first one is a positive answer, which means that a person is recognized as a refugee. The second answer is complementary protection, and this happens when we don't have enough elements to frame the case in the refugee guidelines. However, we consider that if the person returns to their country, they can suffer cruel or inhuman treatment or torture. And the third answer is a negative one. When a person is a refugee applicant, they can process with Migration Institute a visitor for humanitarian reasons card. And this identification provides a regular migratory stay in Mexican territory and allows them to work. And if a person is recognized as a refugee or gets complementary protection, they can obtain a permanent resident status in Mexico. And about time, by law, Comar has 45 business days to give them an answer, but the term can be extended to another 45 business days to get the answer.
Thank you. That was a very complete and useful description of the procedure, which is always a challenge to explain it verbally. Gretchen, based on your experience and considering Miriam's description of the procedure phase by phase, what elements of the refugee determination process in Mexico follow the law, and where do we observe a greater gap between what the legislation establishes and what happens in practice?
Yeah, so I think that generally the main barrier to requesting asylum in Mexico is the lack of infrastructure and the lack of capacity. So there's a huge backlog of cases. I think that you're going to show maybe after we're done talking or before the questions some of the statistics, but the number of cases, people requesting asylum in Mexico has gone up, you know, from it's almost at, I think, 54,000 between January and September of this year. Whereas in previous years, you know, it was 14,000, and, you know, even a few years ago, it was maybe 1,000 or 3,000. So it's just been going up every year, but this year in particular, it's gone up exponentially. So that is the biggest problem, because both the budget of Comar and the capacity of Comar protection officials, and I mean, you can just hear from what Miriam's saying, there's 32 states in Mexico and only 4 official offices. So, you know, if you can't get to one of those offices, which is the best place to apply for asylum, then, you know, that's a huge barrier. So then also the fact that you have to now wait lots of times in order to get you know, they're giving out these little numbers in order to get the appointment, the first appointment with the Comar. And sometimes so many days pass that your 30-day limit, you have a 30-day limit in order to apply for asylum, you know, is up. And so then you have an additional barrier to presenting asylum. Then also people in detention are not being properly screened. I mean, I think that's one of the hugest problems, because if you look at the detention and deportation statistics in Mexico, if you're placed in detention, you have a 97% chance of being deported. So, you know, that just shows how difficult it is for somebody who's been detained in Mexico in one of the 60 detention centers to have access to the asylum proceeding. Also, children, I mean, the whole issue of unaccompanied children who are not supposed to be in detention to start with, they're also being detained and deported and not having proper access to asylum procedure. In the case of children in general, the child protection offices throughout Mexico are supposed to have custody of children, especially unaccompanied children, and make a best interest determination for all children, and that's not occurring. So in some cases, Comar, or the National Immigration Institute, ends up saying, you know, it's in the child's best interest to return home, period, goodbye. So that's one of the, you know, if you look at the number of children, maybe Miriam has the statistics too, of the number of children who are being recognized as refugees in Mexico compared to the number of children who are being detained. And then also for civil society, there's, you know, there's not a lot of capacity on the part of civil society in Mexico as well to help people with representation for asylum cases. And then also in terms of just the procedures themselves, what asylum attorneys say, and also what has been, you know, written up in some of the research that has been done by the Immigration and Refugee or Asylum Clinic of the Ibero University here in Mexico City. They've gone through lots of the decisions and done an analysis on the decisions, and what they've seen is that this again goes back to capacity, that there's not capacity to really do good, you know, thorough legal analysis for each one of the individual claims. There's lack of interpreters, which is, you know, really important, especially when we're having people coming from several parts of Africa who are now, you know, in Tapachula and Chiapas. And then there's also, you know, some littler details, such as people have to check in every 2 weeks, which is one of the things that Miriam just talked about, or every week, depending on, you know, what office, what jurisdiction you're in. And so, for example, right now we have, I think, over 20,000 people waiting for asylum claims in Chiapas, and you know, they don't have access to work because, you know, Chiapas is one of the poorest countries in Mexico. So it would be much more practical for people to be able to fan out and to disperse throughout Mexico so that they can work while they're waiting for their asylum applications, you know, while they're pending. So what ends up happening is lots of people abandon their asylum claims. So that's always been one of the issues.
Thank you, Gretchen. Quite a list. So Miriam, I think that one of the things that Gretchen underscored a number of times was the issue of capacity. So what can you tell us about Comar's resources, both in terms of personnel, offices, equipment? What is available to you? Specifically, what can you tell us about either specialized personnel or training that you receive, for instance, to interview children, unaccompanied children? What resources are there available for purposes of translation? What do you do when people do not speak Spanish? And besides what Gretchen was mentioning, people coming from Africa, we should also think of the Haitians who speak Creole, and also of even persons from Latin America who speak indigenous languages, for whom Spanish is not a first language. What do you do with persons who have disabilities and cannot speak? And thus you need interpreters from sign languages or other needs. What can you tell us about the resources that you have available at Comar?
Well, as I said before, Comar has 3 offices, a representation in Tenosique, and a presence in Monterrey, Palenque, and Tijuana. Right now, it has 48 people of Comar structure, but from previous administration, different places were transferred from other units to Comar. In addition, we have people hired by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and it's important to mention about these non-Spanish speakers that the Secretary of Government has been doing efforts to increase the physical and human resources of Comar, such as the authorization of the budget extension reflected in the creation of the temporary contracts. And I want to point out that Comar staff is constantly trained about interview techniques and research and analysis methodologies. There is a national training program right now focused on specific topics according to the needs, trends, and best practices. And in the next months, Comar will have more training courses for the protection officers. Moreover, we have specialized staff to provide psychological attention to applicants who require it, and to be present at the interviews. Also, about these people who doesn't speak Spanish, the Secretary of Government provides free translation services, and the interpreters signed a confidentiality contract and treat applicants with full respect. Right now, I want to say that we just received deaf mute applicants, and we have obtained a specialist staff so these foreigners can keep their process with all the necessary support they need.
Okay. Are there any specific needs that I did not mention that you, or that Gretchen did not mention, that you have found that are not being met by the system that you can think of?
Right now, we also are trying to train people to attend unaccompanied immigrants so they can have all the support that need from Comar.
Okay, so children is probably one of the greatest challenges, as Gretchen was mentioning. Gretchen, because you are in Mexico and you work with civil society, perhaps you can help us also understand what resources are there available for asylum seekers outside of the procedure. What psychological attention or support do they receive? What about shelters, food, access to healthcare? How are they living while they are awaiting for a decision on their cases?
Yeah. So I think, again, that it really depends on where you are in Mexico. In Mexico City, I think, is where Comar has the most resources and the most, number of agreements with other government agencies. So for provisions of psychological assistance, access to education, even some kind of, job training or better access to employment opportunities. In Chiapas, where Comar also has a big office now, I think they have a brand new big office, but still, because there are so many asylum seekers, it's usually civil society that provides these kinds of services. The UNHCR, as Miriam said, invests a lot of money and provides grants to some of the civil society organizations in Mexico. And then those organizations are the ones that are providing the social services to asylum applicants, and then also refugees once they've been recognized as refugees. But in other parts of the country, there's almost nothing available. So I think that really depends on where you are, and also the issue of translation, the issue of interpreters, all of those same issues, you know, come up again, of course, in the provision of any kind of social services. And civil society, at least as far as I know, we have, you know, very, very little capacity to provide those kinds of services to people from, you know, from Africa especially, and people who speak indigenous languages. So, I mean, what we would say in terms of capacity for the Comar also proves true with civil society, you know, for trying to provide those kinds of services. And then along the northern border, it's also, you know, they're so saturated that there's almost nothing available.
Thank you, Gretchen. It's pretty clear that the challenges are and the needs are great in terms of the response capacity. Miriam, can you please help us kind of understand better how Comar organizes its work? How do you distribute the cases among protection officers? Do you specialize by countries? Do you specialize by a ground for persecution? Do you divide cases by gender, by age? Or some of you focus on working the unaccompanied children's cases? How do you separate the cases? Do you work on a case from the first interview all the way through? Or do you just take cases stage by stage? Also, can you tell us roughly how many interviews would an asylum officer be able to conduct in a month? And how many cases do you do an initial assessment for a decision to be made roughly in a month?
Yes, about the unaccompanied children, we have people dedicated to their specific needs. Because for Comar, it's very important to put special attention on these procedures in order to attend them as soon as possible. Right now, we have started a new task organization, and protection officers are working in teams. Each of them led by an experienced protection officer, and this person organizes the teamwork, guides the protection officers, trains new staff, reviews interviews, and analyzes complex cases. At this moment, it is difficult to reach such a deep specialization by country, gender, or persecution, but Comar is working on this national training program, and this can help us to specialize officers on specific topics. About the number, a protection officer is maybe like 10 interviews per week and 10 cases per week.
Okay. And do you have roughly in your head the number of petitions that Comar received last month?
Last month, I don't have the number, but in this year,
yes,
this year we have 54,377 applications.
Yes. What I'm trying to assess is the number of cases, the petitions that are submitted to the system versus the number of cases that you're able to decide in a month. You see, to understand, because you mentioned initially there are 48 staff persons dedicated to Comar, and there is another additional number of staff persons from other agencies that are kind of borrowed or assigned to Comar. So in that, you know, month by month, how does the backlog increase? Do you have some figures in your mind in terms of each month you are like, okay, we received 5,000 petitions and we were able to decide 100 or 1,000? How, you know, do you have those figures in your head by any chance?
No, I don't have the numbers, and I don't have the numbers of these people hired by United Nations High Commission for Refugees, but that is the reason we are working on this new program to organize all the teams, all the protection officers to get better and better and work on these applications.
Okay, so I want to take advantage of a question that just popped up on the chat in this regard. And so they are asking me, this interview is conducted by one protection officer or by a group of protection officers? The asylum interviews.
Is one protection officer, one interview.
Okay.
10 per week by protection officer.
Great. And when you review the cases, is that like an individual review or do you review cases in teams?
Yeah, as I said, it's by teams, and one protection officer with more experience is guiding and trying to check what is happening, analyzing these cases.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It helps us very much. Gretchen, let's look at the other side. What can you tell us about the possibilities for asylum seekers who are not detained to find legal orientation and or legal representation when seeking asylum? How common is that, or is that a privilege?
Yeah, it's a privilege.
Okay.
You know, we're not exactly sure what percentage of asylum seekers in Mexico receive, you know, access to legal orientation or representation, but we believe it's about 1%. You know, in Tapachula, there are two principal NGOs that are providing orientation and some legal representation for cases. And there's an organization called Fray Matias in Tapachula. And we were talking the other day, and, you know, IMUMI, we receive about 300, we work on about 300 cases per year. And that's what Fray Matias used to work on as well. And this year, they've had over 20,000 people, you know, go through the door. So that means that really what they're giving is some kind of basic orientation. And it's the same for the Servicio Jesuita de Refugiados, the, you know, Jesuit refugee services. So there are a couple of organizations in Tapachula, in Chiapas. Asylum Access is trying to expand services as well, but, you know, perhaps we'll have a couple of lawyers in each of the maybe 6 states where they're working. In Guadalajara, in Jalisco, there's, you know, an organization that will also accept asylum cases. And in Mexico City, there are several organizations that can provide legal representation. And I think that in Mexico City, it's the only place where there's pro bono legal services being offered through, you know, some of the private law firms. You know, there may be some law firms in Guadalajara too that are, you know, providing pro bono services, but what I'm sure about is that there are at least 3 private law firms here in Mexico City that are providing some legal representation. But still, even with all of that, you know, most people, the vast majority of people will never have access to legal representation for their cases.
Does it make a difference in the outcome of their cases?
Yeah, I would say that of course it makes a difference in the outcome of their cases. I don't have the statistics, you know, like you have the statistics in TRAC and all of those reports that have been done in the United States. You know, I would say that it's very, very important, and that's going to make a, you know, a difference in the case, and also in terms of, you know, how the case is presented, issues of family unification, issues of maybe, you know, maybe the family needing to talk about among the whole entire family that the case, because maybe the persecution, you know, was against one of the children and the child is not being interviewed. So, I mean, all of those kinds of issues should be better represented if you have legal representation by, you know, a private, an NGO or a private attorney. However, I think that later we're going to look at the percentages of people who are recognized in Mexico, and they're much higher than they are, especially for Central Americans, than they are in the United States. So I don't know, you know, that's something else to consider as a difference.
Yes, certainly. Now, in terms of greater participation of pro bono attorneys, in your understanding, how common is it for attorneys in private practice to take pro bono cases? Why isn't it more popular as it is in the United States?
Well, I think that it's something, I mean, if you think about the numbers that we were talking about earlier, you know, that there were so few people requesting asylum or applying for asylum in recent years, that One, it's not something that people are used to doing or trained to do. Like in the United States, we have the pro bono attorney within the NGO, and that pro bono attorney is the one who is, the liaison between the organization and the pro bono attorney, so they can receive, training, and they can receive advice throughout the process. And we don't have that here, at least so far. Maybe one of the organizations has something similar to that. But then there's also the other huge underlying issue, which is that pro bono, the whole issue of pro bono in Mexico is not as prevalent as it is in the United States. So people lawyers don't have pro bono, the pressure to do pro bono cases, and the law firms don't have the pro bono coordination or the pro bono office within the law firm, et cetera. And so there's a lot more connections that need to be made.
Okay, that may be an area for future exploration, perhaps. Miriam, so when we think of the large number of cases, 54,000 you just mentioned, how is Comar planning to address its backlog and the increasing number of refugee status determination procedures that are being filed? What are Comar's plans to address this backlog?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, but right now we are attending at the same time a backlog and new application. Like this, we are trying not to continue generating new backlog, and we are giving priority to cases that present any vulnerability situation. I want to mention that United Nations High Commission for Refugees is helping us to attend the increasing flow of applicants, and there has been technical support from the Quality Asylum Initiative to improve the process through the simplification of procedures within the legal framework. As I said, we have received 54,000 applicants for recognition of refugee status. And since 2013, Comar has recognized as refugee to 60,000 foreigners and has given complementary protection to 5,000 people.
Okay, thank you. Those numbers help us kind of understand. Gretchen, I would like to go back to you and ask you about how the government helps refugees integrate into the Mexican society, because we're speaking with Comar, that is responsible for the status determination procedure. But what about other governmental agencies that are involved, or non-governmental or intergovernmental organizations? Who is helping refugees integrate into the Mexican society? And consider challenges in integrating into the education system, the labor market, access to healthcare, just to mention a few.
Right. So, I'm going to say the same thing. I think that it depends on where you are within Mexico. One of the things that's interesting about Mexico is that, just the Mexican population in general is not used to having, a large immigrant population or a large refugee population. I think that one of the government offices against discrimination does a national survey every year. And I think in this most recent one in 2019, it comes out that 74% of the Mexican population has never had contact with an immigrant, which is very strange because they're not thinking in their imagination that their own family members who are in the United States are immigrants, but that's another discussion. But what I want to say is that it's important because government agencies are not accustomed, to looking at other types of documentation. So sometimes they'll look at the humanitarian visa and don't know what to do with it. They've never seen it before, so they don't know whether, that's an appropriate document to, to provide access to some kind of a health program, for example. So people really need to be accompanied in order to have access to health services. Education is another issue. In theory, anyone should have access to education in Mexico, by law, by the Constitution. But still, the issue of what kind of documentation you have sometimes is a problem. And again, it depends on what school you're going to, who's accompanying you, what that person knows. So I think that the COMAR, what they've tried to do is enter into different agreements with government agencies in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to education, sometimes in terms of employment. But then also the UNHCR has developed some programs whereby they're giving grants to some NGOs throughout Mexico to help with integration. And they're actually doing some, I think not very much still, I don't have the numbers, but they're doing some like internal resettlement or relocation of people who are in Chiapas who are now refugees, and they're sending them to Guadalajara or Saltillo, places where there's more employment opportunities. But I would say that it's pretty rough going. I mean, what you're going to get is what is available to people in Mexico if you get anything at all, which also has all of these difficulties in terms of access to health just in general for anyone in Mexico. So you're not going to get something special or more. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's very difficult. And I think for people who have been recognized as refugees in Chiapas particularly are, having really difficult time finding jobs. There's this issue of xenophobia and racial discrimination as well. And I think that it goes back to, the fact that people aren't used to being around foreigners in general. And then in Tapachula, there's been a lot of xenophobia, basically because of the fact that they're detaining people within the state. And so you have this huge number of people in a relatively small city. And, I think it's logical if you don't give people services or provide people with access to, very basic services that, it's going to create a lot of tension within just this local society. So it really depends, but not good.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? And is there any specific governmental agency addressing this tension, doing public education programs against xenophobia in Mexico at this point?
So, I mean, Mexico is a big country, 32 states, 125 million people. And there's one federal agency, a rather small, federal agency called CONAPRED, which is like the Comisión contra la Discriminación. And they have a campaign, but I don't know how, effective they're able to be on a federal level. And then also, remember, 50,000 is a lot of asylum seekers, recently, or maybe it's going to be 80,000 this year. But still, in a country as large as Mexico with 125 million people, it doesn't mean that most people are going to, come into contact with refugees or immigrants. So I think that right now, most of the tension is focused along the southern border and then also in the northern border because of the Remain in Mexico policy.
Okay, so it's really a problem of numbers as well then. Miriam, what can you tell us from your experience and your work? How do you perceive that Mexicans view refugees?
Well, I think that Mexico has a long asylum tradition, which have found in this country another opportunity to put back into their lives. And each person deserves a second chance to have a safe home and live with dignity. Now, as a country, we have at the same time a new challenge and a great opportunity to not only provide better life opportunities, enhance the, but also to boost the Mexican economy, create new business opportunities, enhance the cultural ties, and nourish the social and cultural life in our country.
Okay, thank you. We have a long list of very interesting questions, and some of them are also related to the numbers. So what I would like to share with you, with the audience briefly, is we prepared a graphs on the statistics that that Comar produces every month. You can find these statistics at the web page of Comar. And what we did is that we prepared those statistics and we produced some graphs because we thought it would be interesting to give some numbers and to give some images, because sometimes it's easier to really grasp how the number of petitions has grown, and also to try to analyze how the cases are being decided. So I would like to present these graphs very shortly to open the Q&A section of the presentation. Please remember to post your questions on the Q&A or on the chat. We will address them shortly. I promise not to take a lot of time on this. So these are the number of petitions that are being processed by nationality. Orange is 2019, blue is 2018. So as you can see, then the increase has been significant. It was a little bit less than 30,000 last year, and this year we are close to 55,000 petitions. So just reflects that the number of petitions is at least going to double in the current year if those numbers continue to grow in the rates that they have grown throughout every month. When we look at it by nationality, as you can see, Honduras is at the top of the list, but other important countries in terms of petitions are El Salvador, followed by Venezuela for 2019, again, Cuba, Haiti, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And we have smaller numbers from other nationalities. We begin to have a reference to Ghana, which I think it's important. Now, when we look at it by month, we can see how the numbers were increasing. They start close to the 4,000 at the beginning of this year, while they were close to 1,600 in 2018. And while the peak last year was close to 2,500, this year has been, the peak was over 8,600 in the month of July. So we could see a peak in July, and now we have seen those numbers go down in terms of petitions filed. When we look at it historically, we can see the number of petitions, and we can see this curve showing how it has really gone up dramatically, being close to the 54,000 that Miriam made reference to earlier. In terms of where petitions are filed, this is the information that we find available. We have more than a quarter of petitions that are suspended. And Miriam, I am going to ask you that when we start the Q&A section, you explain to us what these suspended petitions in Mexico City are. And then we have a very small percentage in Tabasco and another small percentage in Veracruz. And as you can see, and this again makes a lot of sense with the comments that Gretchen was making, more than half of the petitions are filed in the state of Chiapas. That would be in Tapachula. So this, I think it's interesting. I think, Miriam, another interesting question that we have is the petitions that are filed before an INM office anywhere in Mexico then end up in the statistics where? We were wondering whether they are added to the statistics for Mexico City, or where are they reflected in this graph. These are the numbers and the overall protection rate by nationality. These are the statistics that are provided by Comar. It's the top 5 nationalities. So we don't have the complete numbers, but you can see both complementary protection and asylum, the rates have increased, and it's interesting to compare the rates for 2017, as you can see here, between 50, 60, 99% for Venezuela, 57% for Guatemala. And then when we arrived to 2019, we observed 100% protection rate for Venezuela, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, and 82% for Honduras, which is an interesting change in terms of the rates. The top 5 countries, and this is a comparison of the 3 years. The darker blue is 2017, the lighter blue is 2018, and the lightest blue is 2019. As you can see, this is Honduras in terms of protection granted. It spiked in 2018. It has gone down a little bit for Honduras. We observe a similar pattern in El Salvador, but the decrease has been higher. In Venezuela, we observe the same. In the case of Guatemala, we observe that rather than the protection granted cases has increased in 2019. Moving ahead, protection rates overall when we compare by countries, and I think it's interesting to see that the 3 years in comparison, we observe some differences clearly. 2018, with the situation of Nicaragua, the number of cases spiked up, and that's why they made it to the top 5 countries. And in 2019, they have remained in the top 5 countries. This is again a comparison between asylum and complementary protection that, as Miriam was referring to, is really very similar to the protection under the Convention Against Torture. And it is interesting to see that most of the Venezuelan cases fit under asylum, and then we have different percentages of cases that fit under that definition of torture. These are the asylum rates by country, which you can compare them by countries. Again, Venezuela is 100%. And in terms of complementary protection, we can see that the numbers are particularly high for Nicaragua, while as Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are roughly between 40 and 30% for the 3 years. This is a pie chart that illustrates the number of petitions by country. 44% Honduras, 20% El Salvador, 14% Venezuela. We have Cuba with 7%, 5% Guatemala, 4% for Haiti, 3% for Nicaragua, and the rest of the nationalities represent another 3%. Please try to remember this pie chart on your heads as we move ahead to cases decided. In terms of decisions, we can see that Haiti has 0%. The percentage of cases decided is extremely low, and Cuba has 1%. Other nationalities have 2%. Nicaragua has 2%, and then we move to Guatemala with 4%, Venezuela 22%, 31% for El Salvador, and 38% for Honduras. And the percentage of cases granted reflect different numbers. Haiti is 0%, Cuba is 0%, we have 2% for Guatemala and 2% for El Salvador. 32% for Honduras and 30% for El Salvador. Now, I think that this final graph is very useful because we can see by country where we are at. Yellow are the pending petitions, and it becomes pretty obvious that the backlog is huge. As you can see, it's the yellow. Gray are the petitions that are denied, and those numbers are relatively small in most cases. Orange are cases of complementary protection, almost invisible for Cuba and Haiti, I would point out. And in terms of asylum granted, we have very high percentages from some countries and also almost invisible to none in the cases of others, such as Haiti and Cuba. I think that these graphs are also an interesting way to consider the numbers, and of course they may also generate other additional questions. So let's start with the Q&A. We have interesting questions in this regard. Miriam, let me start with you with those questions that are related to the asylum procedure. So Tizion is asking us about what happens with those individuals that do not have identity documents. Many start their journey months ahead. Many are robbed during the trip, and they lose their identity documents, or they may be stolen during the journey. How can they seek assistance when they lack any documentation in specific. Another interesting question that they are asking about children is, who is considered a child in Mexico? What is the age according to Mexican law that a person is considered a child? Can we start with those two questions from you, Miriam?
Yes, as I said before, there's no need to have any identification document or travel document to submit an application for the recognition of the refugee status. And we provide a document that point out that a person is a refugee applicant. So with this document, person can show to authority, migration authorities or somewhere else, and they can say they are refugee applicants. And about the children, it's under 18.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Andrea is asking us about the number of people that make up one of these teams at Comar. How many protection officers make up a team?
It's like 4 protection officers per team.
Okay, thank you. Amy Jensen asks an interesting question that I would like to pose for both of you, to Gretchen and to Miriam. Let's start with you, Gretchen. How can people support migrant and asylum seekers, specifically within the process, and how to deal with stress and trauma?
You mean how can, is that like a general question or what?
Yes, that is the general question that I ask is, you know, if someone is participating in this webinar or finds the webinar on YouTube and is wondering, how can I help? What can I do to support migrants, to support asylum seekers? What can they do?
Well, so, I mean, that person should be in a process. I mean, ideally, I think that any asylum seeker should be in some kind of an emotional process, because just even going through the asylum process and having to talk about your case, having to talk about what has happened to you, you know, in the United States, they have all of this, you know, trauma-informed training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in ideal circumstances, that person should be receiving professional assistance throughout the process for, you know, the emotional situation. A lot of times that helps people be able to talk about what has happened to them, because when they're going through the process, they have to, you know, give an interview, write it down. They have questions asked of them time and time again. And so also to know ways to avoid re-victimization. But we're always looking for, I mean, even, you know, with the technology that exists today, sometimes we refer people to psychologists, and they're able to have their sessions by Skype, for example. So, you know, that makes things more available. But definitely, you know, assistance. And also, I don't know if you're, I mean, we see this all the time, mothers with children, you know, help with childcare, help with economics, help with, you know, sometimes we'll take, you know, boxes of supplies to people who are waiting for asylum, and we know that they're living in, you know, horrible conditions. You need basic humanitarian assistance. I mean, it also depends on where you are. I mean, in Tapachula right now, things are so bad, people need basic sanitation. So, but definitely, I think within the US, there are, you know, tons of programs for ways that you can support people. But in Mexico, it's much more difficult.
Okay. Miriam, what can you tell us? Do you have the possibility when you're interviewing an asylum seeker and you realize that this person is dealing with stress and trauma and that they need some form of mental health treatment, can you refer them somewhere? What can you do with those kinds of cases?
Yes. First of all, we have a specialized staff on this psychological attention, and they can be at the interviews with the applicants, so they can feel this support and talk about all the reasons why they left their country. And also we can talk to a hospital or something like that, and they can go there and talk about all the situations that they are living.
So you have like kind of protocols developed and like a good relationship with mental health hospitals or clinicians that can offer that mental health treatment?
Yes, that depends of the assistance departments, and they are working constantly with them.
Yes. Okay, so let me get through a couple of procedural questions, and then we can kind of put together some of the questions regarding the numbers. Andrea Tanco is asking whether the Comar takes any biometrics of the asylum seekers, particularly considering that you mentioned that it's possible to request asylum without an identification document if they lost it on the way. This is for you, Miriam. Do they get any biometrics?
Yes, yes, but this is because all the refugee applicants can have a Mexican identification called CURP, that is a number for all people here in Mexico, by Mexican temporary residents, and now the refugee applicants. So that is a number that can provide, with this number, they can go and get a work and health services. So that is the reason why we take the biometrics.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Gretchen, this seems like a question for you. If an international NGO wanted to hold a high-level meeting with one or more Mexican officials regarding Mexico's response to asylum seekers, which officials have the power to make policy decisions? And which offices ought to be strategic targets for advocacy? This is from Mariana Sawyer.
Well, there's one, head of the Comar, who is Miriam's boss. And I think that, I would start there. He's the one who's making decisions about, what happens internally within Comar. One of the issues in terms of capacity, which we're always trying to advocate for here in Mexico, of course, is budget allocation. So we've been working a lot with the Congress, and that's been really frustrating because you can tell that the Mexican government is not invested in improving protection. I mean, just by looking at the numbers, I think they allocated 27 million pesos, which is like $2.3 million to Comar for the budget for next year. So I would speak to, if you want to talk about this like seriously, I can actually put you in touch with people, but Andres Ramirez is the head of the Comar. Some people within Gobernación, which is where Comar is, and then also, we've had this strange situation in Mexico since the so-called agreement on the 7th of June of this year, whereby the foreign ministry has actually taken over immigration policy within Mexico. So now there are also people within the foreign ministry who would be important to talk to. And then finally, the Mexican representative for the UNHCR, Mark Manley, also has information about the efforts that they're taking to try to strengthen the Comar. But, if you really want to, if you're really planning on coming down here and doing some kind of advocacy, I would be more than happy to talk to you about who to talk to.
Thank you. Thank you. I will share some information with you after the seminar from Marianne. Okay, let's try to address some of the questions regarding the numbers. Let's start with you, Miriam. Valentina Capelletti is asking about the highest percentages of cases pending from Cubans and Haitians. What can you tell us about this? Why are the numbers of cases decided from Haitians and Cubans so low?
Well, I want to say that every case is different. The reasons that a person have to leave their country are different. And now at the Comar webpage, you can find all the numbers about nationalities, and in this specific case about Cuba.
Okay. What about Haitians? What is happening with Haitian petitions? Why is the number of cases decided so low?
Well, as I said, every case is different, and we have all the information there.
Okay. Other questions that are being asked about the numbers that are interesting, and Gretchen, I would like your opinion on this. A number of comments on the Q&A section are making reference to how impressive that almost 100% percentage of granted cases is to everyone, that they are receiving either asylum or complementary protection. However, when you look at the overall number, what we can see is that the vast majority of cases are still pending. On the other side, Gretchen, you also mentioned that that there is a large number of individuals who are detained who could seek asylum and apparently encounter great difficulties from seeking asylum, and thus they are returned to their country, back to their countries, even though perhaps they would have thought to seek asylum. So what explains that a case moves forward and another case does not, in your experience? Miriam talked to us about, trying to address the backlog and identifying cases of persons with special vulnerabilities. But in your own experience, you received 2 cases at the same time. Are they resolved in the same amount of time, or do things happen that one case is decided much earlier than another one that perhaps it's still pending?
Well, again, I think it depends on, which one of the jurisdictions you're in. We've had cases that are resolved within, a couple of weeks, and others that take 6 months. And of course, that has to do with the case itself, what kind of evidence you're presenting, and also where you're presenting it and the amount of backlog. One of the things that I wanted to say about, the percentage, the acceptance rates, that's important that I don't think we spoke about, was the fact that in Mexico, in addition to the convention definition, Mexico also accepts the Cartagena definition. And so in the case of Venezuela, they have guidelines that have determined, basically prima facie that Venezuelans are refugees either under the, the Refugee Convention definition or the Cartagena definition. And there's also guidelines now that they're implementing, supposedly, at least in Tapachula, for Hondurans. And so in theory, the acceptance rate for Honduran cases should be going up too. And whether you're recognized under the Refugee Convention definition, which, by the way, in Mexico also includes gender claims, it's actually much broader than it is in the US, or you're accepted under the Cartagena definition, which is even broader, which can include generalized violence. You still get permanent residence. I mean, you're still recognized as a refugee without any difference, and you can still reunite with your family. And so I think that speaks to refugee acceptance rates. The issue of the backlog, I'm not really sure, what the Comar is doing to work on that, because a lot of the backlog was in Mexico City. And so now we have backlog from 2017 in Mexico City. And what happens with a lot of people is that they become so frustrated that they abandon their cases, or desist from their cases. I'm not sure if that's a word. And so a lot of times the percentage, the acceptance rates we're not taking into account the number of people who actually abandon their claims. So I think that would change a lot if we did that. And then it's also important to remember that, a lot of people who originally would have been trying to seek asylum in the United States are now seeking asylum in Mexico. So several years ago, people sometimes would request asylum in Mexico as a way to get some kind of a documentation and then continue with their cases and request asylum in the United States, you know. And of course, if you have the choice and you have family members in the United States and you know you can get a job and you have a network and also you're not going to be kidnapped or killed, it seems like the more logical choice. And so my sense now is that, you know, with more restrictions on the U.S., you know, on the U.S. Side of things, that maybe people are going to hold out longer. So I don't know, we'll have to see. So there might be fewer people abandoning their claims in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. I also want to make reference to a comment and a question that we have here. Our audience is quite surprised to hear that Mexico requests help from UNHCR, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees provides that assistance to the Comar. So they are wondering why the United States is not doing something similar and asking for help from UNHCR so that they can address their backlog and perhaps they could take a higher number of asylum seekers. So I don't know, Miriam, if you can tell us something else about the assistance that you received from UNHCR. You mentioned the training. What else does UNHCR help you with?
Yes, we also have, as I said, technical support, and they are help us to attend the increasing flow of applicants. So that is the reason we are receiving all the support from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Okay, and following that, on that, another interesting topic that on which UNHCR is also involved are those individuals that are stateless. And we have a question. They are asking that they saw Black Africans who were traveling with a document that indicated that they were stateless. And so they are asking what process, if any, is there available in Mexico for a person who is stateless? Gretchen or Miriam, do you know anything about protections for stateless persons in Mexico?
Yes, so I think that Miriam can, you know, discuss the procedure for people who are stateless, you know, the apátridas. But what I think the document is referring to are just recently what's happening with people is they don't have any documentation. You know, if they're applying for asylum, then here in Mexico, a lot of the African countries don't have any consular representation either. Even though, you know, you wouldn't go to consular representation if this person is an asylum seeker necessarily, but sometimes that's a better way for people to try to get some kind of identity documentation. But what I've seen is that recently the Immigration Institute is giving some of the Africans these documents that I think that person is referring to, which is permanent residency as a stateless person because they don't have any identity documentation. So yeah, there's a procedure for that as well. But I also think that a lot of the African asylum seekers who are stuck right now in Tapachula or in Chiapas, you know, are really trying to get to networks in the United States. And so it's been this push-pull situation where I think that ideally the Mexican government should give them humanitarian visas so that they can try to figure out, at least have better information and move to a place within Mexico where they have access to, you know, more legal representation and other kinds of services so that they're not having to make these desperate situations, you know, while they're living in tents outside of the detention center.
Mm-hmm. We almost have to round up, so I would like to give each of you the opportunity to make any final comments or to, I don't know, address something else that you felt you were not asked that you would like to complement your participation in the webinar. Miriam, is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything we didn't ask you that we should have?
I just want to say There?
No, now it's better, yeah.
I just want to say that we are working and we are trying to getting better and to attend a backlog and new applications, and we are working so hard to support all these refugee applicants.
Thank you. Gretchen, what would you like to make any final comment?
I think just to the, you know, that we're in such a difficult situation right now because we've never, I think, seen the types of restrictions the U.S. is placing on access to asylum in the United States. And so we're in this, you know, ironic situation where we want to strengthen refugee asylum protection in Mexico, but the idea is not at the cost of, or, you know, the cost of having access to asylum in the United States. The United States is, you know, one of the largest and wealthiest countries in the world. And it seems that the resources that they have, and even people, you know, willing to support asylum seekers and refugees in the United States is so important. And so it's been really hard to kind of have both messages. It's not one thing, it shouldn't be one thing or the other, or one country or the other. You know, we should continue to try to strengthen the asylum system in Mexico, while at the same time trying to strengthen the asylum system in the United States.
Thank you. Gretchen and Miriam, thank you very much for your participation in the webinar today. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank my colleague Irastu Gomez, who is Alianza Americas representative in Mexico, for her valuable work in coordinating the webinar. Gretchen and Miriam, we appreciate your time and your generosity in sharing with us your experience and your knowledge. We value very much the work that you are doing, and we understand the great challenges that you are facing currently in Mexico. We hope that after this discussion, we have been able to better understand those challenges and also to start to grasp ideas of what is necessary to address particularly the problems that we observed concerning the backlog and the increasing number of applicants in Mexico. We also understand that the challenges are not only related to the status determination procedure, but that are also related to the integration of refugees in Mexico. And that is, I think, and also another important task that we understand that the Mexican state is facing. We also want to thank our audience for the lively and interesting discussion, the questions that you posted. We will upload the webinar to our YouTube channel, as I mentioned, and you will be able also to share it. I was asked as to whether I could share the diagram of the procedure that I shared on the screen. This is from UNHCR, and I will be happy to share it as well with all the attendants in the seminar today. Thank you very much, Gretchen. Thank you very much, Miriam, and thank you very much, audience, for your participation today, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.